death, it can be human nature to fall back into euphemism. People pass away, they pop their clogs, or they shuffle off their mortal coil. But however it's put, the reality of the situation is always the same. One moment a person's alive, and the next, they're not. The life that was within them is no more, and to borrow another turn of phrase, we might say that they've moved on to the other side. Whatever that is, recording or measuring death isn't, though, quite as straightforward as perhaps it should be. Broadly, there are two categories to consider: cardiopulmonary death, when the heart stops pumping blood, and brain death, when, with or without a beating heart, the brain stops functioning. Medical professionals also speak of clinical death, which is when a patient stops breathing and again their heart stops beating. Thanks to contemporary CPR, though, you can be brought back to life from clinical death. Cardiopulmonary and brain death, by contrast, are deemed irreversible. But there's a lot of legal controversy here, with different countries, governments, and groups recognizing death in different ways. For example, by some standards, brain death equals full death, and the person suffering it is officially deceased. But by other standards, they're not. In America, the rules and laws can change from state to state, with the rights of the dead and the dying never universally agreed upon. The apparent uncertainty can lead to high-profile cases in which the status of a person is debated and decided in court. Have they died, or haven't they? But the wider question of the moment of death is, of course, about far more than purely the legal technicalities. It's a prospect that's understandably feared by many, but also treated with seeming calm by others. Accounts of near-death experiences are often therefore of great interest. And today, NDE stories certainly aren't rare. The most common traits involve bright lights, tunnel vision, and life recall, usually explained as life flashing before your eyes. There are various proposed scientific reasons for these phenomena, with many boiling down to an NDE being the brain's last attempt to make sense of what's happening to it. After a lifetime of survival, it's suddenly receiving all the signals of imminent death, and it's as though the stress gets converted into an NDE. So the idea goes. Those who recover from an NDE also often report a newfound feeling of gratitude and purpose in their lives from there on out, with that personality shift perhaps again being the result of the unusual brain activity that they've just experienced, according to some theories. Arguably, the strangest NDA cases of all, however, are those which involve a reported out-of-body experience. There are ever-increasing claims of patients seeing themselves on the operating table, for instance. One argument is that this is a specific type of confirmation bias, where because people have come to expect to see their own bodies in the hospital, they then believe that that's what really happened. It's an argument that rarely holds up against the person reporting the NDE, though, as they remain sure that what they've experienced wasn't just a cognitive trick. There are accounts of the patient witnessing things they can't have possibly known about before, too, and therefore can't have imagined. Snippets of conversation that they weren't technically alive for, or small details about the room that they can't possibly have learned unless they somehow had a bird's-eye view of it. And while we've made so many other advances in neuroscience in recent decades, we don't yet have a reliable, catch-all scientific explanation for NDEs. The mystery of death remains. But that said, an NDE, by definition, also isn't death. A person may well have been brought extremely close to their demise during it, but they still never actually had that final moment. They lived to tell the tale, which in itself means that the tale wasn't terminal. Arguably, the closest thing we have to a true account of death, then, are recorded last words. Again, a person's final thoughts and exclamations still can't stand as their final moment. But society tends to pay close attention to what's said just before someone passes away, perhaps in search of clues as to what it's really like. While famous last words are often reported differently depending on the source, and some claimed last words weren't actually spoken especially close to the death of their speaker, some of the most widely repeated include those of Charles Darwin, who's said to have exclaimed, "I am not the least afraid to die," and those of tech pioneer Steve Jobs, who reportedly said, "Oh wow," 3 times over. There are also reported cases of last words that are more pained and pessimistic. The writer Victor Hugo allegedly said, "I see black light," although perhaps the most common theme sees last words being saved for a declaration of love, as is said to have happened with the writers T.S. Eliot, Arthur Conan Doyle, Emily Bronte, and more. Given that another trait of NDEs is a claimed feeling of euphoria, perhaps there could be found some kind of biochemical reason as to why feelings of love and wonder should seemingly present themselves during a dying person's final seconds. There are suggestions that, as the brain desperately tries to combat what's happening to the body, it revisits the best feelings and memories that it can find. Again, though, there's no one scientific explanation for what happens, and there are no expectations that we know of. In a past video, we saw that a recent study had, by chance, captured the last moments of a dying brain, when a patient, unfortunately, suffered a heart attack and passed away during an otherwise routine EEG scan. In this case, the patient's brain was found to have had a surge of wave activity for around 30 seconds after the heart had stopped. While researchers were unable to say with certainty what his mind will have experienced at the time, there were broad suggestions that the parts of the brain linked to memory were seemingly the ones that were most put to use. Although his heart had failed him, the patient's immediate cognitive response was to draw on experiences of his past, before all brain activity ceased as well shortly afterwards. However, as this was the first case of its kind in which a brain had been monitored before, during, and after death, and because it shows what happened for just one person, scientists are wary to draw too many wider conclusions from it. As with everything else, what we don't understand about death continues to eclipse what we do. As for what happens afterwards, the religions and faiths of the world provide plenty of options. Depending on which you subscribe to, there's the prospect of heaven or hell, of being reborn on Earth one day, or of being transported to some other, usually higher, next dimension. Science does have a little more to say about this, especially regarding the physical body, which has been tested and studied for centuries to improve our knowledge of disease, but also of decomposition and the general redistribution of the energy that had once been held within a person. Of course, the soul and memory of a person will live on long after they themselves have passed, not least in the minds of those who knew them. But there are increasing options in the modern world for the physical body to offer more too. Some opt to donate all or part of their bodies to science, be that as an organ donor or as a general case for further study. Meanwhile, while the more traditional options of burial and cremation remain popular methods for putting a person to rest, the rise of the green burial industry is gaining momentum, with so-called mushroom suits earning more and more headlines. Designs differ, but these suits are made to be worn by the deceased so that fungi can get to work converting their physical selves and even the toxins within into nutrient-rich soil. In this way, when something new grows from that soil, it can be argued that life after death really and definitely is achieved. When it comes to this topic, there remain so many unknowns, but thanks to a combination of scientific study, NDE recall, last words on record, faith, philosophy, and innovation,